Our last presentation on the Civil War had the advantages and disadvantages of both the North and the South listed. We really need to identify, however, why the Union won and be specific. Lincoln's leadership is a major factor. His primary goal as president is to preserve the Union. Part of preserving the Union was defeating Southern secession. Lincoln did offer numerous times throughout the war for the Southern states to re-enter the Union, and he even offered for them to keep their slaves. As morale dwindled in the North and anti-war movements began, however, Lincoln needed to give the Union a cause to rally around. So that cause was freeing the slaves. The catalyst for this cause was the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Lincoln used the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam as a springboard for the issuing of this speech. Major features of the Emancipation Proclamation included that slaves in the rebelling states of the Confederacy were free. Also, that border states that remained loyal to the Union could keep their slaves. This is really only symbolic. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't really free any slaves, but it did give the Union Army something to fight for. Here is a famous painting where Abraham Lincoln is reading the Emancipation Proclamation to his presidential cabinet. Pictured here, seated to the right of Lincoln, is William Seward, his Secretary of State. Seward edited Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. This document toured through Syracuse and was put on display, and I actually got to see Lincoln's first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation with William Seward's handwriting on it as he edited it for his friend. African Americans in the war. Early in the war, neither the North or the South allowed blacks to serve in the Army. The North changed its policy and allowed blacks, especially given the Anaconda Plan and the need for large armies. They served in segregated units. Often these units only did labor work. By 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, blacks were beginning to serve in combat. A famous example is the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, serving with distinction at the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and 40% of his black unit is killed in the battle. Here is a famous postcard depicting Shaw and his men at Fort Wagner. To the left is Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, and to the right is one of the more distinguished black officers that Shaw and his subordinates promoted for his leadership abilities. The stripes on his arm signify that he is a sergeant major. His name was John Rawlins. In 1863, men were drafted into the Army. There were anti-draft riots that often targeted blacks because it was believed that they were the reason for the draft. Conscription led to the Union Army's ranks growing even more. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus and put people in jail with no formal trial during the war. Many protested that this was unconstitutional. After the war, and after Lincoln's assassination, the Supreme Court said that military tribunals could not be used in the place of civilian trials where federal and state courts were in operation. This is known as ex parte milligans. Pictured here is Mary Surratt. Mary Surratt owned a boarding house in Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth and her son John Surratt were friends and often met in her boarding house. They hatched a plot to kidnap President Lincoln in her boarding house and, without her knowledge, changed that plan to assassination after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. She was put on trial in a military tribunal. The prosecution was allowed to prepare its case for much longer than her defense attorney was. She was not allowed to testify on her own behalf. And there were many other things that a civilian court would provide the accused that were not provided in the military tribunal. Mary Surratt was convicted of treason and hung. After her son John Surratt came forward, he was afforded the opportunity for a civilian trial in which he was found not guilty. Ironic, because John Surratt was probably far more guilty than his mother, but because his mother had been tried by a military tribunal, she was executed by hanging. There are a lot of debates among historians today as to whether Lincoln had the right to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Supporters say that the Constitution allows it because it says, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it, in Article 1, Section 9. Opponents, however, say that because that was in Article 1, only Congress had this right. To allow it of the President opens the door to one-man rule. Most historians come to the conclusion that Lincoln's actions were limited and that it was necessary in the context of the times, especially because he returned control to Congress after the war was won. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is an amazing speech. It was only 2 minutes long, but it ranks as one of the best speeches of all time. The man that spoke before Lincoln spoke for over 2 hours and was one of the most well-known speakers of the time. Nobody remembers his speech or his name. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address will always be known. Its major topic was to rally everyone to finish the war and restore the Union. All of these various reasons lead to the obvious conclusion that the Union was bound to win the war, given their long-term advantages. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure you take the online quiz. Use your notes so that you can perform very well. If you've taken good notes, there's no reason you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.